Welcome to our 7 Principles sermon series, focusing on the sixth principle of Unitarian Universalism, which reads, "We covenant to affirm and promote the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all." I begin with this from John Balaban, a Vietnam War soldier poet. After the war, with such Cheshire cats grinning in our trees, will the ancient tales still tell us new truths? Will the myriad world surrender new metaphor? After our war, how will love speak? I discovered this poem as an undergraduate studying literature, focusing on 20th century drama. My honors project examined American plays in the Vietnam War. It was winter 1990, during the lead up to Operation Desert Storm. At that time, some of you may recall, there were many vets camped near the Vietnam Vets Memorial in Washington, D.C. Realizing how much more informed my thesis could be with the testimony of veterans, with the people most affected by warfare, I went to the mall in Washington, hoping to make some connections with people who had direct experience. The men I met, many of whom had profound physical and psychological injuries from Vietnam, were eager to share stories. Many of them were homeless or living marginally. Some had camped there to remind America, they told me, not to repeat the mistakes of the Vietnam War. There were a lot of guys with motorcycles and ponytails and big bellies beneath black t-shirts. They set up this tent city, including displays and photos, singing songs, inviting folks to come listen to their tales. The men of this tent city had much to teach us. Their lives had been altered by a war that few understood and fewer, especially at that time, wanted to think about. Many expressed feeling invisible and discarded. And it seemed these men were not pushing a partisan political agenda. Their presence in Washington was more an embodied prayer that as war was approaching in Iraq, that American soldiers should never again be abandoned. As a college student, I didn't have much money. But still, when I went down, I would bring what I could, usually beef jerky, peanuts, beer, of course, was always a favorite. Some offering of thanks for the stories that I was offered. I befriended this time a homeless man named Keith, who had a tent there. He had lost a leg to a rice field landmine in Vietnam. The wheelchair that he had was rusty and falling apart. Though he had a tent, in winter he slept in a box over a storm grate so he could stay warm. At that time, he had not spoken to family in years. Despite all the traumas he endured, he was one of the funniest guys I ever met. He would always say, "Laugh or go nuts." And he would tell stories, none of which I should probably repeat from this pulpit this morning. He breathed a kindness and a love that just belied the horror of his tour in Vietnam. We would share a drink, lunch, and some laughs, and I would return to my warm suburban home in Bel Air, Maryland, in awe of his courage and furious at how he'd been treated by his nation, by us. One day in early spring, I went to find him, but he was gone. None of his friends near his campsite on the mall knew where he had gone, and I was very sad. I enjoyed his big raspy laugh and his long, intricate stories full of tears and rage. There seemed to be so much more to ask him about the war. But then it dawned on me, Keith and I had really done all we needed to do. I thought about this because I had been on a bus tour, the Southern Civil Rights bus tour, and I had encountered folks who had suffered the ravages of racism. And one thing that we learned on that bus tour, that often the best thing you can do is to just sit quietly and listen. And that's all I did with Keith. I just sat and listened to his stories without judgment, without question. It's an emotional kind of learning. It's what I would call, as a minister, a ministry of presence. Keith taught me we should be wary of a patriotism that continually demands more money, more weapons, more enemies, more troops, and an ever-widening definition of self-defense. He also taught me how important it is to treat the warriors well when they come home. Now, I think it's important for me to claim that I am not a pacifist. I believe both in a nation's and an individual's right to self-defense. Personally, I am more apt to fight than to flee. Our world requires that the United States have an efficient, lethal, and humane military. Indeed, our very republic was formed by a violent revolution, and slavery ended only with immense carnage. I'm not a pacifist. I believe when determining the use of force, we should ask, what justifies a call to arms? What type and amount of our force will we use? What is our duty to the innocent masses formerly under the rule of the now vanquished foe? And how will we treat the warriors with compassion when they return? Americans are a peace-loving people, but we do have an unreflective, warlike culture that seems to distance us from the effects of war on our enemies. It even distances us from the effects of war on our warriors and on ourselves. Now, warrior cultures are not inherently bad. They have many good values. The willingness to stand up for what is right, to defend to the end lives, people, values, and a way of life. Yet our culture seems obsessed with death. Think about it, whether it's the form of murder or abortion or capital punishment or violent video games or gory movies or bloody new sports like extreme fighting or murder mystery reality television or shockingly gruesome crime dramas like those things where they're dissecting people on network television. We're obsessed with death. We have this love of gore that comes out in these ways in our culture. It's just good to recognize this. And even in our attempts at improving the fabric of our society, we use the imagery of war. We declare war on inflation, war on poverty, war on drugs. If we don't like something, we declare war on it. And as comedian George Carlin once noted, we do have the only national anthem with rockets and bombs. Too often, we fail to recognize and criticize the powerful motivations hidden in many aspects of our unreflective warlike culture.